So, John, you're going to prompt us if we start to like wind down or flounder.
Sure.
You're going to ask us questions.
I'm gonna, and our enthusiastic audience members will have brilliant questions for you too.
Who are you?
Who am I?
Yeah.
My name's Brody.
About an hour, I figure.
Oh, great. Okay. Everybody introduce themselves.
Oh,
you guys. Brody.
Yeah.
Not just-
There you go. All right, we're on. Good morning. My name is John Mackler. I'm the OTREC Education and Technology Transfer Program Manager. Welcome to the PSU Transportation Seminar Series. We have a special seminar this Thursday morning, an unusual date and time. We have a panel of distinguished guests this morning to talk about the progress of transportation legislation in the Oregon legislature. So I will introduce them in a moment. They will take a few minutes, I guess, give some opening remarks, talk a little bit amongst themselves. I'll prod them with questions. Hopefully our audience assembled here will have some questions for them, and hopefully some of you out there in the internets will have some questions for them as well. You can email those questions to psuseminar@yahoo.com. One more time, that number on your screen is psuseminar@yahoo.com, and we'll get that here in the classroom, and I can relay those questions to the panel. So, without further ado, I'll introduce Randy Tucker from Metro, Chris Hagerbaumer from the Oregon Environmental Council, and Olivia Clark from Trimet. And I think Olivia is going to give us some kickoff statements.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and thanks for you people who are in the room here to have a discussion with us today. I think the transportation legislative picture from Salem actually began over a year ago when Governor Kulongoski began an effort to put together a transportation vision to take into this legislative session. And the three of us were actually involved in that in one way or another. And what he did was really lay the groundwork for putting together a legislative proposal, a balanced package on the road, transit, alternative mode side, which was then put into a bill format and delivered to the legislature.
Okay, are you hearing me up there?
Okay, that led into our thing. That led into our thing. I got B, F, and G on.
Culminating right now.
This is up.
You gotta turn it off.
When it began, unemployment was already going up. The mantra is really budget cuts, a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen, and that really, I think, has overshadowed what we had hoped would occur with transportation. It's not a very pretty picture right now, so I think there's a lot of thinking behind the scenes about what are we going to do with the transportation package this legislative session. Leave it at that.
Well, yeah, there's another trend I think to mention. You mentioned the change in the economy since the conversation began. Can you hear me on the internets out there? There's been a major change in the economy starting last fall when everything collapsed, a slow trend accelerated, let's just say. But the other big trend I think that's worth remembering in the context of the transportation package is gas prices, which a year and a half ago were up in the $4 range and then plummeted last year down to where they are now, about half of that. And so the calculations among policymakers about if you're going to raise revenues, how do you do it, gyrate wildly with the public's attitudes about gas prices. It was a huge issue back during the presidential campaign, and then it just evaporated. And what the policymakers first say, well, we can't raise gas taxes because gas prices are high. We're going to have to look at registration fees, and then the gas prices come down and the calculations change. So the big question, of course, if you're going to do a transportation package is where do you get the revenues? And that question has not been answered.
And I'm wondering if our audience actually knows what all is in the transportation package. Should we go through that for folks? And I'm not going to get everything. So why don't I just talk a little bit about the environmental components, since that's a big piece of what we're working on. So I'm with the Oregon Environmental Council, and we've been working with Thousand Friends of Oregon, Environment Oregon, and others to make sure that whatever transportation package is passed this session, that it not only create jobs, but that it lower transportation costs for folks, and also really lead to a future with stronger, healthier communities where people have lots of options for how to get around. So primary to that is getting the funding needed for alternative modes. Olivia is here representing transit, but there are all sorts of transit districts all around the state that need more funds to run their system. Senior and disabled transit is desperately in need of funds. So that's a big piece of it. And then a second really big piece is with population growth, with the threat of global warming, we need to figure out how to build our communities in such a way that people are able to take advantage of alternative modes so that people can actually bicycle and walk to where they need to go. So we have worked to embed this concept of the major metropolitan areas in the state, that they would look at their piece of the pie as far as greenhouse gases are concerned from transportation, and take steps to meld land use and transportation planning so that in the future we're able to capture and lower those greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So those are key to us in moving this transportation package forward. And what's really great about these pieces is that a lot of people think, oh, jobs, when they think about modernizing our road system, building more roads. There's actually evidence that shows that investments in transit can create 30% more jobs than investments in road building. And that's out of a recent report by the, I'll have to look at my notes, Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Folks have been looking at this issue related to the stimulus package. So that's one thing we've been working on, but the package, a big piece is how do you raise money, period, for roads or for transit, and so maybe you guys can speak to the other components.
I'll just jump in and anyone can follow up. So just to summarize there was a bill introduced at the beginning of the session. It was based on the process Olivia described that the governor convened. There was a committee called the Governor's Vision Committee that met most of last year, and there were some other committees that met as well.
And if anybody wants to look it up, it's House Bill 2120.
Right, I was just going to say. House Bill 2120. It's long. It's got lots of sections, 50 some odd sections. The proposal that it embodies the proposal that came out of the process last year, the Vision Committee process. And just to summarize sort of the high points on that, it raises about $500 million a year through a combination of registration fees and gas taxes primarily for roads. That's the road piece. It continues the program called Connect Oregon, which is lottery-based and has funded over the last couple of legislative sessions a couple $100 million in investments in multimodal transportation, primarily freight, but also public transit. So air, rail, marine, and transit. And that's been $100 million a year the last couple of sessions, and this session, the proposal in the bill is $150 million. It tells ODOT, I think is a proper way of saying it, to flex all of its flexible federal dollars. In other words, all the money that it gets from the federal government that can be spent on something other than roads, the bill tells ODOT to spend it on something other than roads. Is that an accurate statement? And that is about a $44 million pot of money that that is available for multimodal investment, but has historically been spent on the road system. And so that's a very important piece for people who care about a multimodal system. And let's see, I think those are the three big financial pieces, if I'm not mistaken. But
although transit as well, there's a separate bill that would raise cigarette tax to fund senior and disabled, and there's also the payroll tax.
Yeah, House Bill 2120, the three pieces in it, well, actually four, for transit. Randy mentioned Connect Oregon, and then the flex funds. The others are a cigarette tax increase proposal. That's not in 2120. It's in separate legislation. It may end up in House Bill 2120. And that's just building on the cigarette tax that elderly and disabled transportation receives now, about 2 cents. And the governor recommended raising it by another 2.5 cents. Actually, it was PSU Jennifer Dill and Margaret Neal did a study of the need for elderly and disabled transportation resources that has helped document that need. The fourth piece is the payroll tax proposal, and what the governor had recommended is that, well, let me back up a second. Transit provided by Trimet and the Lane Transit District in the Eugene area, Lane County, the bulk of their operating revenues comes from payroll tax on employers in the region. And in the 2003 legislative session, the legislature voted to allow Trimet to increase that payroll tax, the first time ever in history since 1969, by 0.1%, by 1/100% per year over a 10-year period. The governor has, in his proposal, recommended that that be accelerated. We're about halfway through that increase, accelerated, which would actually take place in 2011, and then build extra capacity by allowing the mass transit agencies to go for another 0.1% in the future when the economy recovers. So those are the major components, I think, of the bill. There's also some interesting policy pieces, I think, around the creation of a Transportation Utility Commission, which I think is one of the most interesting pieces in the bill outside of the finance side that would begin maybe you should describe it, I think you know, which would begin to look at transportation needs and least cost planning of utility model applied to transportation funding, which is really very, very innovative. And the bill calls for, I think, sort of an interim study or a closer look at that. How would that work, where you would actually have a Transportation Utility Commission that would assess the condition, I think, of the state's transportation resources and determine what level of resources are needed. And I think they might even, like a Public Utility Commission, maybe have the authority to make that happen. I'm not sure.
Well, and the concept is
initially, but
actually,
yeah.
right, to study that over the next couple of years, that concept of the Transportation Utility Commission, as well as the concept of least cost planning, which is basically saying when you have a transportation problem, you should be looking at the full panoply of solutions and be balancing a number of different goals, including how cost effective is this meeting such social goals as reducing greenhouse gases, as a safe transportation system, whatever goals are important to the state feels are important to embed in that decision. And it would be similar to how utilities might say it's actually cheaper for us to lower demand for electricity than to build more more power plants. So a similar concept can be applied to transportation. So the concept is that folks would go away for a couple of years, they'd come back to the legislature with how would we do these things, and there may be some need for authorizing legislation.
Politically, the Transportation Utility Commission has run into heavy seas in the legislature. It's basically, the idea is that one way you could characterize it is removing authority from the legislature to set transportation, to establish the transportation revenue structure. And the legislature, on the one hand, never wants to raise any revenues. On the other hand, they don't want anybody else to have the power to do that either. And so the governor has also not been all that committed, I don't think, to the Transportation Utility Commission concept, at one point suggesting that it be moved into a separate bill so as not to drag down the rest of the bill, I think, was the concept there. So I think that concept is still struggling for acceptance in the legislature. Least cost planning, I think, is doing a little bit better. It wouldn't be implemented instantaneously. It would be figured out, I think, going forward. And it's worth noting that Peter DeFazio, also our main transportation policymaker in our congressional delegation, has spoken strongly about least cost planning at the federal level. I think it's a concept that's coming, hopefully sooner rather than later. Let's see. I'll just mention one more thing in that you suggested. Chris talked about reducing demand as opposed to increasing revenues, or increasing supply, I guess would be the proper analogy. There's a small program that you've probably heard about if you listen to Oregon Public Broadcasting or many other places, the Drive Less, Save More program, which is something that is run through Metro. It's a regional effort to to get at transportation demand management. And there are many other transportation demand management tools out there, and there's an effort to re-up the money for that, though that would not be in the transportation package. Should we talk about tolling at all? It's worth noting that there's at least one key legislator who is very interested in developing a congestion pricing program for the Portland metro area, and it's a well-placed key legislator. And so that those discussions are kind of going on quietly around the side. Let's see, I guess there's not much more in the package about tolling, though. Is there? No.
Yeah. Maybe we should transition to where we are at this moment.
Politically, yeah.
Politically. We're right, smack dab in the middle of the state legislative session. April is about the time when the wheat becomes separated from the chaff, and we kind of get a sense for what their priorities are going to be. I think that transportation is high on the list for some of our legislative leadership, but there are other competing issues as well, given the state of the economy. When the legislature first convened in January, they had to immediately deal with a budget shortfall in the current biennium and cut programs. They're now looking at, I think, over a $4 billion cut in the next biennium. So that sort of overshadows everything, and that means that they're also going to need to raise. Yes, it's going to rain inside the Capitol, I think, after the May revenue forecast. Excuse me, but that has an influence on how many times the legislature is willing to go up the hill and raise taxes, which is a battle that the transportation package then becomes factored into, whether it's going to be a corporate minimum vote or a provider tax for health care or whatever it is. Somewhere transportation's on that list.
Beer tax.
Beer and wine tax, cigarette taxes, whatever it is to raise revenue. At the same time, they're going to be cutting state budgets. So we've had, up to this moment, we've had some hearings on basically what the Vision Committee came up with and some tentative look at House Bill 2120 in the House Transportation Committee. And early on, the Senate Transportation Committee had sort of an open forum for people who wanted to come in and talk about the package. But no definitive action has been taken yet on the transportation package. And in fact, behind the scenes, there's been some kind of innovative polling, web-based polling going on to try to, since conditions have changed, as we discussed earlier, from when this package was developed to current conditions, is what would be palatable at this point. And the polling's been, I think, done by Conklin, Fisk, and McCormick, facilitated by the Associated Oregon Industries, and many different private sector and public sector groups have contributed to that. And some of us were able to see just some very preliminary results of the polling, which is not terrific. There's an overriding, as you can imagine, there's an overriding sense in the public right now of fear. Fear about their job loss, fear of loss of their health care benefits. And that's really casting a pall on anyone's willingness or interest in raising taxes. So the transportation package, gas tax in particular, registration fee increase, title fee increase, cigarette tax increases, get factored into that. So when you ask the public what they are willing to invest in, it's really ideas around coming out of a recession. What can we do to get ourselves out of this? And transportation investments actually are something that pull fairly high. Road and bridge investments, road repair, and interestingly enough, transit and bus investments come up at like 69%, something like that. So that's good, but then when you ask people what are they willing to pay for to make that happen, the numbers go down significantly. There were some packages that have been tested around a small gas tax increase, a small title fee increase, an increment increase in the registration fee, and it's really hard to develop a package that actually gets more than about 35% of the people's support. So we're definitely swimming upstream in terms of getting an increase in any kind of tax passed this legislative session. Do you want to add to that, Randy?
I think I'm going to throw one number out that I remember from this polling, which is that of the people that participated in it, there were a couple of rounds last fall. I think the most recent one was December of the actual sort of large panel polling. And in the 2 rounds, the people were asked, has somebody in your household lost a job? And the first round, 25% of the respondents said yes. And in the second round, 33% of the respondents said yes. And those numbers just blew me away. So it's because, I have a job, and the people I see every day have a job because I'm working and they're working. But the environment out there is really, really tough for a lot of people. And so that's one thing to mention. The second thing, I think the overarching thing to remember about the public opinion research that's going on is it's not really framed as what's the transportation package that you'd like and how much do you like it. It's framed as what do you think is the best thing we can do for job stimulus? And then it takes people down a path of talking about transportation, but it's really framed around jobs and not about we have these needs in our transportation system. And so I think the legislators that are in the position of putting together a package are thinking like that and trying to figure out how they not only create a package that is helpful to the transportation system, but one that the public sees as valuable and ergo one that the public might support if somebody puts it on the ballot, which apparently people are, the usual suspects that do that are salivating to do.
So in addition to transportation investments, there were 2 other areas that the public feels that investments in those areas would help us come out of a recession, or they're more comfortable with. So there's transportation investments, but there's also water and sewer, water facilities. That scored just as high as transportation, I think about 77%. And school facilities, K through 12 facilities, not education itself, but the actual buildings. And you think back to February, I think, during the legislative session, the legislature, after they had dealt with the budget cuts for this biennium, went on to create their own stimulus package. And in that stimulus package, they included some funding for repair and rebuilding of state school facilities or state higher ed facilities. So those are 3 things. And I wouldn't be surprised if whatever package finally surfaces out of the legislature actually combines some of these things, some of these other infrastructure investments with transportation. So it's not, as Randy said, it's not exclusively about transportation. It's about getting us out of the recession. Can I just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a couple of the other points I think that came out of that that Randy was talking about. There isn't a lot of support for any kind of funding. The one thing that polled, I think, over 30% was tolling. There's certainly a certain amount of support for tolling, and you're seeing some tolling. I think we talked about the tolling legislation that allows Multnomah County to toll the bridges. There is that. Yeah,
that's actually passed. A bill has passed, at least the Senate. I don't know if it's passed the House yet, that would authorize Multnomah County to toll the Willamette River bridges.
As a revenue-raising source. And after that, there's the support for any kind of revenue raising really goes down, but I think tolling is at the top of the list. Congestion pricing doesn't toll very well.
But the understanding there is that congestion pricing is not well understood by people. And if you're doing a survey, it takes a lot of explanation, and people go, I don't get that. You could speculate as to why tolling polls well. One speculation is that people always feel that somebody else is going to pay that toll. The tourists are going to pay that toll too. Everyone's just passing through, so not just us. And that's true of gas taxes as well as many things. So,
I think in this economic climate, anything that people have to pay is difficult. But I think a lot of people don't realize how little we pay for our road system. So if you think about let's say you're driving a car that gets 20 miles per gallon. Let's say you drive 12,000 miles a year, which is approximately average, and you're paying a gas tax for the state, 24 cents a gallon. Okay, help me do the math here. That's something like $150
or less.
And on top of that, you're paying a registration fee for that year. It's what, 27, thank you. So when you think about that compared to your electric bill or something like that, you pay very little for a system that is incredibly expensive, and we're allowing it to deteriorate every year. So again, nobody wants to raise taxes or pay more, but I think very few people realize how little we pay for our state system.
So I want to mention 2 other things that are not linked to what we've been talking about. One is the federal stimulus package, which was, as you know, passed in February, and there's been a lot of activity at the state level and the local government level about how to allocate those monies. And you know, for the state as a whole, including the state level and the local level, on transportation, it totals around $300 million. It's a big injection into the transportation infrastructure economy all at once. And there is some, I think, well, maybe this is my own view, but I think some question as to how well and quickly that money can be gotten on the ground. There's a big emphasis on making decisions to get it on the ground fast, but then you have to actually get it on the ground, and it's going to be very difficult to do. And I think it's important that that go smoothly from the public's perspective if we expect the public to offer up any more money for transportation. If we can't spend the money we've got effectively and efficiently, when we get a big bunch of money, then the public's going to go, well, you know, why should we give them more? And the other thing I want to mention, this is just my personal plug for a project that we're working on at Metro, but that many other people care about. This is a separate bill that has to do with, but hopefully would end up in the transportation package if a miracle occurs. And it has to do with funding for non-motorized transportation, basically bicycle and pedestrian facilities. We've introduced legislation. Actually, it's sponsored. Excuse me. It's sponsored by legislators from all of the metropolitan areas of the state, and equally sponsored by Republicans and Democrats. That we're calling Connect Oregon for Trails. So it's modeled on the Connect Oregon program that we described earlier for freight and transit. But there is no real source of funding out there right now for transportation facilities that are not in the road right-of-way and that are there to serve bicycles and pedestrians. And so the classic example is the Springwater Corridor on the east side, which has, you know, several 100,000 up to 1 million people using it a year. But there's no real source of funding for facilities like that, so we've got a bill that's being heard next Monday in the House Transportation Committee. It's House Bill 2902, and I'll just put my plug in for that. But ideally, that would end up not being a separate bill, but being something that would be part of the package for a relatively small amount of money compared to the size of the package, but it would round out the system, climate-friendly, you know, inexpensive, no gas used, et cetera, you know.
I think politically, what you remind me of is that whatever comes out of the legislature needs to be a balanced package.
Yes.
I think given the composition of the legislature and the needs that we confront, I think there's a sensitivity to that there needs to be road, non-road, alternative modes in that package.
We've been talking for like a half hour. Are there questions that people have?
Sure. So I start in the room. If you have a question, I'll demonstrate. If you have a question in the room, you need to press and hold the button on the microphone that hopefully is on the table in front of you. So does anybody in the room have a question? Okay, well, let me ask one from. We have one question online to start with that I'll read it verbatim. It has to do with a comparison between funding in the Oregon legislation and federal legislation. So I'll just read it. The JTA, the Jobs Transportation Act, proposes to spend 9% of new funds for non-highway projects and 50%, five times as much for modernization highway capacity projects. The Bush administration budgets regularly devoted 20% of transportation funds to options. JTA. In other words, JTA devotes less than half to the green transport what the Bush administration budgets. The Obama stimulus package devoted 39% of transportation funds to options, 4 times as much as the JTA. So while the JTA contains some positive policy proposals, the budget appears to do more harm than good for climate change, devoting substantially more new money to highway widening as to non-highway projects. If this is a truly green proposal worth supporting, shouldn't it at least do as well as the Bush administration 20% or the national average 39% in the stimulus package?
I'm going to take that one because I want to relate something that happened last year as part of the process of the Vision Committee. The Vision Committee established a the Vision Committee met for a few months, and then it broke up into some subcommittees. There was a Revenue Committee, there was an Environment Committee, I believe, and the third committee was called the Multimodal Subcommittee. And that subcommittee was chaired by Metro Councilor Rex Burkholder. And that committee recommended back to the full group that Oregon seek to replicate the percentage that John just mentioned of 80% of revenues being devoted to roads and 20% to other modes. So the ultimate report that came out set that as an aspirational goal, but the proposal doesn't reflect that, and I think the main reason is Oregon's constitutional dedication of all revenues that are that come from the use of an automobile or a motor vehicle, essentially, to roads. You can't spend gas tax, you can't spend registration fees, any kinds of fees that are associated with the operation of a motor vehicle on anything but the road system. Whereas at the federal level, that some of that money is flexible. And so the Vision Committee's report suggested the creation of a non-highway, I believe, transportation fund, and it's suggested that 15% of lottery dollars in the future be dedicated to that fund, and that would be a huge step in the right direction. But for this biennium, given the horrifying budget situation and the fact that the lottery in Oregon's budget essentially is a backup to the general fund, it's dedicated to education and economic development largely, and education, of course, is the largest single item in the general fund. So when the general fund is suffering, the lottery backfills the general fund. The actual proposal that came out does not include any of that dedication of lottery dollars to multimodal transportation. So it's problematic that the percentages that John just described are what we're looking at, and we need to do better. But it's a bad year for that.
Although I think that those percentages are just looking at the dollars that would be raised through the car-related fees compared to the flexing of the federal funds. And if you count Connect Oregon 3, which has to be authorized by the legislature, which is multimodal in nature, that brings the percentage up a bit, as does, if we hopefully get a payroll tax, that brings the percentage for alternatives up more. And the other thing is that half of what is raised in gas tax, registration fees, and so on goes to cities and counties. Cities and counties are absolutely desperate for road repair. And my sense is that they would spend most of their dollars on road repair. So you're basically looking at the other half as being what the state would be spending. And yes, if it has to spend half of it, it's ridiculous to force it to spend half of that on modernization, in my opinion. But there are pieces of the package that, this is a group effort, and not everybody loves every part of it.
It's also worth noting that the proposed $500 million in new revenues for roads is likely to be whittled away. I think the sense that I have, just from hallway conversations in the Capitol, and also from some of this public opinion research, is that the legislature is going to be gun shy about a number that big. There are some interests, like the truckers, that would pay a lot of money, and that are also, I think, gun shy about a number that big. We're looking at something smaller than that. If the road revenues come down from $500 million a year to something more like $250 to $350 million a year, or something like that, and the flexible funds stay the same, then the percentage gets better. I mean, it's kind of a paper exercise to figure out the percentages when you're doing it that way. But at any rate, it's worth mentioning.
Okay, so if I'm doing this right.
I think you have to, at the bottom of the thing, and then the red light. Yes, and then the red light will come on. There you go. Yes, hold it down.
So Multnomah County, the Multnomah County Tolling Authority, the county does not own all of the bridges across the Willamette River in the Portland area. Does the bill contemplate them having the authority to toll, for example, on the Steel Bridge, which they do not own?
No, it just removes the prohibition for their tolling their own bridges, I think. It's very simple. It's about 2 lines, the effective part of the bill. And no, it doesn't have any anticipation that they're going to take over any other bridges or anything like that.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking that. What I was thinking is that the impacts to the local circulation in the Portland area for all of these
Oh, I see what you're saying.
bridges being tolled.
If some are tolled and some are not tolled.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Hopefully the bill passes, that's something that you'll be talking to Multnomah County about.
They don't have any plans to actually do that right now. It's basically removing a prohibition that applies specifically to Multnomah County in the statute. They're portraying it as more of a kind of a cleanup right now, but of course down the road it could happen with a lot of discussion.
And I believe that has to happen with any bridges that are have federal funding that went into them, right? Doesn't the federal government have to say you may toll a bridge that's already been built?
If it's their bridge, I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I just had a question about the Lynn Jackson, that, allow them to do the 205.
That bill would not, no. That's obviously under discussion in the context of the Columbia River crossing. That's on the table anyway.
There is a bill
yeah.
that would allow tolling, or actually, would allow tolling on both of those bridges.
But that bill anyway. That's a big discussion that's happening, not primarily in the legislature, I don't think. Would you agree?
Right, on the CRC.
Yeah. And it's not affected by this bill that we're talking about.
Any other questions in the room?
Good. Yeah, hold it down.
By the way, the Multnomah County tolling bill, I think it's Senate Bill 36, something like that. So it's easy to find if I'm right. It's Senate Bill 30-something.
So partly because of the economic downturn, but even setting that aside, the cost of owning and operating a vehicle, I think the trend line is going to be that less percentage of the population is going to be able to afford an automobile. So what I'm wondering is how is that notion at all influencing legislation in Oregon? To me, it's almost an environmental justice issue relative to a percentage of funding for transit, for example.
Well, I think that the decisions that we made many years ago to funnel most of our transportation money into a road system have led us to a situation today where people spend upwards of 20% of their income on transportation, and it is ironic that at the very time we need more options like transit, we don't have enough dollars to fund those systems. I think the American Public Transit Association estimates that people could save about $8,000 a year with a good transportation system. There's other research. Joe Courtwright's research on the Portland Green Dividend shows that when people are not spending as much on transportation, they're spending more on local goods and services, because if you think about it, when you spend $1 on a gallon of gasoline, almost all of that is going out of the state. It's not supporting our own state's economy. And so there's a lot of evidence out there to show that if you have more options for people, people can spend less on transportation. It's absolutely an equity issue. Whether our legislature really thinks about that very much, I don't know.
Dave, I don't think it's received much discussion directly. And I think it also points back to something that Randy said, that it's very difficult for the state to figure out how to fund transit because of the constitutional issue and because we don't have a sales tax. Most states fund transit with a sales tax, and we do primarily with a payroll tax, which is very different. But I don't think that conversation has really penetrated at the legislature.
And one of
Go ahead.
the one of the concepts that was discussed and recommended by the Vision Committee was the idea of letting these local transportation districts, local transit districts, levy a parking tax on commercial parking spaces. That concept has been around for a while. So if you were a business that provided parking to employees or to customers, that you could levy, 5 cents, 10 cents per space on those businesses. It would be a corporate tax. like a payroll tax, but actually would, I think, be, when you think about that concept of what should we be taxing, much better to tax something that, like a parking space, that we would actually like probably less of in the future related to our stormwater and so on and so forth. Now, that recommendation did not get into the governor's package. I think it's still worth discussing at the legislative level, and I hope that sometime we're able to do that.
The thought that your question spurred in my mind isn't a direct answer to your question, but it goes to the politics of the legislature. I would describe the legislature as being made up on this topic of three categories of legislators. There are the no new taxes people that won't vote for this because that's just their ideology. There are the progressives that are not opposed to voting for a tax, but they want to see a balanced package and they want to see something that moves us forward and probably would embrace the thought behind your question. And then there's the moderates from both parties, and those are the people that are going to write the bill. Because they're the people that happen to be chairing the committees, the vice chairs of the committees, the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, and the chairs of the Ways and Means Committee are all, I think, people that for the most part, don't fall on either the far, the far ends of the spectrum. And I think there are probably some people in that group that are more open to, more innovative thinking than others. But then you have to add to it the kinds of political forces that work upon them, and the big dogs in transportation politics, and people who think only about transportation politics, and who give a lot of money in political campaigns, et cetera, are just watching this like a hawk. And those are, people like the truckers and AAA and others, other sort of major economic forces that still play a big role in our legislature. And so I think it's heavy lifting to bring, really innovative and cutting edge ideas forward. And then you add to it the economic crisis that we're in and the difficulty of bringing anything forward, even just to deal with the bread and butter aspects of the existing system, which is really what people are focusing on right now, and how that can support the economy. And I think it gets really difficult to bring in new ideas. The thing that I mentioned earlier, the trails effort, I'm under no illusions that that's going to be instantly embraced by a majority of the legislature and funded fully. So as much as it's important to raise it and to maybe get a crumb, it's something that is, I think, not going to be a central element of anything that's going forward.
Oh, you're reminding me of another piece that we didn't mention in the package, which is currently our law says that when you're building a new road, re-whatevering it, you need to spend at least 1% of that on bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in that corridor. And this would actually raise that percent. What's happened with that is that now that becomes the maximum that gets spent on those things, which is unfortunate. But so the idea would be to raise that to 1.5% of that project's costs would be spent on bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in that corridor, and that's running into some problems. So,
John, recently you're hearing more and more from the Republican sides nationally about being negative on the federal stimulus package and talk of their Senate budget kind of reversing some of that tide. Has that dialogue and negativeness on the federal side trickled down to the state level about how we look at the transportation as being a stimulus for jobs and the like?
Well, I think you came in late, but we talked a little bit about, I would say no first, but we talked a little bit about some of the polling that's been going on that shows that investments in transportation, water and sewer, and educational infrastructure is actually one way to bring us out of a recession. But there hasn't been a lot of talk at the state legislature about the federal stimulus package, what's happening there, other than at ODOT and among local governments as to how we're going to be able to get the money on the street and start building. But the legislature really hasn't spent, to my knowledge, much time talking about the federal stimulus package. Their own stimulus package really did not deal with the transportation side.
Right, it was more the perception of what the stimulus was doing and how we were rolling out money. Is that the same negativeness about how we're doing that at the federal, seeped into how we're looking at doing it at the state level? Okay.
Yes, beyond the Connect Oregon for Trails and increasing of the funding for pedestrian and bicycle projects from 1 to 1.5%, and understanding that there's not a lot of money for these kinds of projects, could you speak more about overall how much money is being proposed for bike and ped projects and what the whole picture is for that group?
I think that any of these funds that could be flexed to multimodal includes, as Randy mentioned earlier, airports, rail, transit, bike, ped. So the idea is not that every single dollar is accounted for as to where it goes in this package. It's raising the dollars, and then it's up to the local communities and the state, when it's a state project, to decide where those get spent. We have this extremely unfortunate system in Oregon that the massive amount of money that is, the largest amount of money that is raised has to be spent on the road system because of the constitutional restriction, which makes it difficult, by the way, to do the least cost planning that we were describing earlier. But at this point in time, trying to change that constitutional dedication, I just don't know that that would be a ballot measure that would be a difficult one to achieve.
Okay, first of all, there's 1% for bikes of the road money, bikes and peds, of the road money that is currently raised. If there's a significant increase in road money, say there's $500 million more of road money, that's another $5 million out of that for bicycles and pedestrians. If the bill's provision that raises it from 1 to 1.5% goes through, it would be another $7.5 million plus another 0.5% of all the rest of the money, however much that is. There's a bill that would raise the percentage to 2%, and there's another bill that would raise the percentage to 3%. They're out there as markers. I don't think anyone expects those bills to go forward. The 1.5%, I think, is still at least in the realm of possibility, but would be heavily contended, I imagine. So that's one thing. And as Chris pointed out, there's the $44 million in this package that is not specifically allocated. One other thing I wanted to mention is that the federal stimulus package ended up, I don't know the numbers here, I could get them for you later, but some chunk of that money has been dedicated to bicycle and pedestrian facilities, at least in the Portland region, I know. Of the $330-odd million that came to Oregon for transportation, about $100 million of that was sub-allocated to local governments and not programmed by ODOT. And of that amount, I don't know, it's like 40 million or so, 30, 40, something like that came to this region. And I know a significant chunk of that, at least in the context of what's usually spent on bicycle and pedestrian facilities, went for those sorts of facilities. But I don't know the numbers.
I'll just add on to that and give a little plug to our partners at ODOT. I think with a certain amount of pressure from local government and the environmental community, their portion of the federal stimulus dollars that they actually were able to keep, they spent a huge chunk, the first chunk, on roads, but then they opened up the second piece to alternative modes. And I have to give them some credit. Not necessarily a first, but I think a positive step forward in funding bike and ped projects, not just in the metropolitan area, but
right.
They had probably 5 hours of testimony from interest groups and communities, mayors from all over the state that actually came in asking for sidewalks, which I thought was fascinating. And they funded some of those, and they also funded some of our own bike and ped projects up here. So I want to give our partners at ODOT a little bit of credit for that.
I think the breakdown was about 20% for non-road. I think it should have been higher, but it was better than a lot of states. I think I heard Massachusetts spent about 44% on things other than roads. They did better than us.
Well, that money was a rare slug of federal money that was large and entirely flexible. And so, on the one hand, I think Olivia's comments are to the point. They heard the message from people, and they improved in their second allocation. On the other hand, there are still people going, "Gosh, we could have spent more of that," because it was what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, no strings attached. No strings attached.
We have another question here. What is the status of the proposed requirement for metro areas to plan for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions? And Chris, I think you alluded to that a bit.
So that did not make it into the bill originally, even though it was part of what the governor asked for in his drafting instructions to Legislative Council. And it took several weeks until basically last week for us to resolve what that language should be. We worked with AAA and the truckers, and the environmental community worked with them to come up with language that everybody agreed to. So it should be in the next iteration of the bill.
Well, we're coming up on that. Oh, Teresa?
So this morning's Oregonian, so where do you want Max to stop, is talking about the planning effort for the next 30 years of potential transit or non-bike ped alternative modes in the Portland area. The article said that if all of the projects were completed, it could be $25 billion to be funding all of that, but that the Metro projection as far as transit funding availability was only $2.7 billion. So since that's like a tenth of the need, I'm curious as to what the projection for the future is in terms of funding if this transportation package doesn't move forward.
Well, that's a really good question, and I think I can only speak from a Trimet perspective, is that the payroll tax piece that we discussed earlier that's in the governor's package is critical to being able to build anything in the future. Having that extra capacity to go to 0.8% in the payroll tax means that we'll be able to leverage the federal funds to build out that high-capacity transit system. The federal government, when we compete across the nation with the Los Angeleses, the New Yorks of the world, we have to show that we have 20 years of operating capacity for anything that we bring into this region. We also have to show it's a good project. We always have good projects. We have to show that we have the local match as well, which is where some of those billions of dollars come from. It's increasingly difficult for us to patch together what that local match will be without some other funding sources. But it's that payroll tax piece that gives us the operating capacity to show the federal government that, oh yes, we actually can keep these things running once you give us the money to build them. So that's critical.
Okay, well, it's about 9 o'clock. So unless anybody has a closing statement you'd like to offer, one last word. Oh, I forgot to mention this.
Thanks for inviting us.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the folks who showed up. Before we applaud you, I'd just like to plug, tomorrow is our regular Friday Transportation Seminar Series, and we have a gentleman named David Levinson coming from the University of Minnesota. He'll be talking about a transportation land use integrated research project that he's been working on. So that may be of interest to you or to some of our friends out in the Ethernet. So thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to Randy and Chris and Olivia for spending their morning with us. So thank you very much.
I'm the activist. I said, contact your legislator.
Yeah. I should have said that about my trails.
Hey, you got your plug in.
However many people are out.